very honored to have a special guest with us today, Jeremy Martin. Now, understand, Jeremy, you look a little different from when I first met you. You used to come to the gym with your dad. I owned a gym in Canada, and your dad was one of the members. You used to come in with him and play in the kids area there. You were like, what were you, about 2 years old then?
Yeah, I guess I would have been about 2.
You're taller now with a beard.
Just a bit, yeah. The good news is you haven't changed at all.
Thank you. The check's in the mail.
Yeah.
I want to give you've chosen a path in life. Your father's a physician. You got really into athletics as a kid, and this was the direction you took. You're going to University of British Columbia, which is a very reputed university on a number of different departments, right?
Yeah. It's a pretty highly specialized research university, especially. So
perfect. Yeah. Now you've got your bachelor's in kinesiology, and what are you working on now?
I'm currently writing my master's also in kinesiology with a focus on coaching and specifically strength and conditioning. Okay,
now that's a scholarship program you're on.
Yes.
Now you're also, your credentials here are quite extensive. You are an NSCA certified strength and conditioning coach, and you work at you're a graduate assistant at the University of British Columbia Strength and Conditioning Gym. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we're at the Varsity Strength and Conditioning Center, and we work with every varsity athlete that UBC has. So we get an average of 650 different athletes per week coming through our gym.
So what's your role with those athletes?
As a graduate assistant, I work under our head strength and conditioning coach and our assistant strength and conditioning coach in leading the workouts, helping design the workouts, and just basically making sure everything runs smoothly and that the athletes are doing the movements as best as they can, and making sure everybody's doing it safely as well.
Gotcha. Now, you yourself, you're also a competitive athlete. You started off, you used to do your standard bodybuilding type training. You got into powerlifting, and then you got into MMA, did a few fights. You got into strongman competitions, and now you're into Olympic weightlifting. Which of those do you like the most?
I always found whatever sport I was in currently was the one I liked the most.
Yes.
But I do have a bit of training ADD, so I tend to flip from one thing to the other. I find the Olympic weightlifting to be the best right now just because it's the easiest for me to access training for. I'm always by a barbell and plates, and so I can throw them around whenever I want. Strongman, it's a little harder to find Atlas stones and yokes to carry around just in your average local gym. So
right.
The ease of access really helps with the weightlifting. Plus, it makes me feel a little bit more like an athlete. So it's a fun one to take on.
Good. Now, the reason that we're talking today is you are part of our professional advisory board for FITLife Magazine. Not only for your education, but certainly for your experience. You've got a tremendous amount of experience, and tremendous amount of experience as a trainer and an athlete, both. I want to talk now. One of the things that we experience is, guys that are, in the mid-30s and beyond. We kind of get a chance and we want to, make that resurgence, go back to the gym, get started again, and you see it a lot now, especially with CrossFit and things like that, where people are going relatively, what I would call untrained or deconditioned athletes are going in and wanting, for the desire to do something a little bit differently, like training ADD, like you said, but going in and they want to get involved doing some of these, more what I would call technical movements. Now, of course, anything like weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting, where you're doing the clean and jerk, you're doing high pulls, you're doing things like that. Or powerlifting where you're doing heavy squats or heavy deadlifts, any of that kind of stuff. It's from my own experience as a competitive powerlifter, I know that's something that it's not just a matter of lifting heavy weight. There's a whole process that you go through to condition your body and like that, and all the connective tissue, train your body so that it is ready to handle those kind of loads and those kind of movements. Can you just sort of expand a little bit on that? And what it is it's just not that we're trying to discourage people from doing these things. But there is a process, and if you could talk about the process a little bit.
Yeah, there absolutely is a process, and kind of what you touched on before is what I tell all of my clients and the athletes I work with these types of movements, the number one thing you have to remember is that they're a sport in and of themselves. And anything that is a sport is generally going to be highly technical. And the squat and the deadlift and the bench, they definitely have their technical aspects. But like you said, the biggest issue with those ones is making sure that your tissue has the integrity and the resiliency to actually undertake those movements at a high load. And all that requires is what we call progressive overload. And so I'm going to start an athlete or a client by loading them at a pretty light weight and making sure that the movement looks good and looks perfect every single time, so that as we load them further and further, it's not going to be a technical or a tissue breakdown that causes them to miss the movement. And that's going to avoid injury for the most part, unless something out of our control happens. But what I always say is that we're going to prevent the preventable as much as we can, because that's our job as strength coaches. When you get into something like the Olympic weightlifts, those are moves that people train twice a day, 5 to 6 days a week for 10 years and still find ways to improve, which means that trying to come into those right away and be proficient at them isn't necessarily going to happen, and people have to realize that. And so I break the movements down into their very, very absolute elements and then start to piece that all together as we go. And so that might mean starting with just the basic hip hinge movement, like a Romanian deadlift, and making sure that we're hinging from the right place and extending the hips fully, and then making that more dynamic and getting the bar moving a little bit. And then maybe you're starting to catch it and doing a hang power clean from there. And you work on your front squats and you work on your overall strength until you can put all those pieces together and hit the full lifts.
And so the point being is that if you want to go back to the gym and you see this, I think, now with CrossFit, they do a lot of those specifically Olympic lifting movements, and to dive in there and try to get a quote unquote workout, where you get your heart rate going and you get a pump and do all that kind of stuff. Doing those highly technical movements, then, in your opinion, is not necessarily the safest thing to do. This is a process to condition your body to be able to do those, to learn them, and then be able to handle them.
Exactly. Okay. And that's number one thing that I look for with my clients. And I have clients who do CrossFit that come to me for Olympic weightlifting technique. And so I see them every week, and for an hour, all we do is technique with those two movements. And it's been a year or more process of getting them to where they can technically do the lifts and they can handle it for higher and higher loads. And then we can start to look at, okay, these WODs or these workouts that the CrossFit people are doing are things that now you can handle, because it's a low enough percentage of your maximum that you're not going to break in form with these movements. And that's the number one thing.
And of course, the number one concern is injury, not so much being able to lift more, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's just avoiding injury. Now with movements like high pulls or clean and jerk, things like that, your high risk is shoulders, knees and backs, stuff like that.
Yeah. The number one thing I would see in anything where people are hinging from the hips, like in a clean or a deadlift, is a lack of tension in their backs. And so they'll end up breaking through sort of the spine and the vertebrae, and that's going to put an extra strain on those areas. That's going to cause a low back injury. Sometimes you'll see a scapular sort of injury in the shoulders. Snatches are really bad for shoulder injuries, and I'm pretty picky about who I let throw a bar over their heads in the snatch position, because unless you can stack your shoulders and actually hold that position, there's no point in trying to throw a bar up there and sit down into a squat.
Makes sense. Yeah. Well, listen, this is really helpful, Jeremy. We'll be talking a lot more in the future about different methods of training, different ways of learning how to do things, the important things to focus on. I think just to summarize then, it's safe to say that technical movements in the gym are things, and especially when you're wanting to use a lot of weight, relatively a lot of weight, a heavy weight for you, is something that is very, very important to learn the proper form first and master that form before you try to move on to doing these things as a form of exercise, or to get to the point where you're throwing a lot of weight around. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Move well before you lift heavy.
Good tip. Well, thanks very much, Jeremy. We'll talk to you again soon.
Sounds good.